Diving in. Today, we're looking at this whole idea of male devaluation, but specifically how it shows up in the way society views, like male anatomy. And, you sent over a bunch of sources for this one.
I did.
And a lot of them are focused on this men going their own way community, the MGTOW folks now. I know MGTOW, it can be a bit controversial.
It can be.
But for this deep dive, what we're going to try and do is pull out kind of like the key observations and patterns we see and, let you, the listener, draw your own conclusions.
It sounds good.
So, big picture. How do we view male anatomy? What kind of messages are we sending out there, through humor, entertainment, even just everyday conversations?
That's the question, isn't it? And what's fascinating is these sources, even though they're coming from a very specific viewpoint, they do point to these patterns, these underlying messages that a lot of people might not even realize they're absorbing every day.
Right.
It's about how we talk about male bodies, how we depict them, ultimately how we value them.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumps out from these sources is this word, junk.
Yeah.
It's like the go-to term for male genitalia. And it's everywhere.
It is.
Movies, TV shows, stand-up comedy, you name it.
It's so common we almost don't even think about it anymore.
Right. But if you actually stop and think about that word junk, it's really loaded, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about what it implies. Something discarded, worthless, maybe even a little repulsive. And then contrast that with the language that's often used for female anatomy, which tends to be more delicate, more, I don't know, poetic even sometimes.
That's a good point.
That difference in itself is pretty telling, I think.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the underlying values there. And, it's not just external sources using this language.
No.
I was looking through some of these YouTube transcripts, from some of these MGTOW guys.
Right.
And even these guys who are talking about, men's rights and all that, they're using junk to describe their own bodies. It's almost like they've internalized this idea that it's something to be ashamed of.
It really makes you wonder how deep that conditioning goes, If even the guys who are advocating for men's rights are using this language, it suggests like a level of societal programming that's, deeply ingrained.
It's almost like we're all swimming in this sea of messaging and we don't even realize we're getting soaked.
That's a great analogy.
And speaking of messaging, let's talk about this whole groin shot thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's practically a staple of comedy, right? Guy gets hit in the crotch, everyone laughs.
Classic slapstick.
But you sent me so many examples.
I did.
Movies, shows, these viral videos. It's kind of alarming how pervasive it is.
It's become a default punchline almost.
It really has. But, if we take a step back, what's the underlying message there?
Right. It normalizes violence against male anatomy, makes light of male pain, and ultimately, I think it desensitizes us to it.
It's like it's saying, men's pain is funny. And again, there's that stark contrast. We rarely see this kind of humor directed at female anatomy.
Very rarely.
It makes you think about the double standard.
It really does.
And, some of these sources, especially some of those YouTube videos, they go beyond just the physical pain.
Yeah.
They talk about the emotional impact of constantly seeing male bodies targeted in this way.
Like it contributes to this sense of disposability.
Yeah, like men and their bodies aren't as worthy of respect.
Exactly.
It's a really interesting point.
And that's a key takeaway from these sources. They're arguing that this constant bombardment of these messages, even if they seem harmless, like a comedic groin shot, it can actually shape how men view themselves and how society values them.
It's really making me rethink some things I've just passively accepted for years.
Me too.
But this deep dive takes a pretty dark turn when we start to look at how male genital mutilation is depicted in media.
Yeah, that's where things get really intense.
You flagged some seriously disturbing examples.
I did.
And it's honestly shocking how often this comes up.
It's more common than you might think.
Like the fish scene, the dog scene.
And countless others.
It's intense stuff.
It is. And what's even more disturbing is that it's not just confined to like horror films or extremely dark comedies. You see it in more mainstream entertainment too.
Emily.
Yeah, there's this recurring theme of male characters being subjected to this very specific kind of violence, often without any real justification within the story.
So it's just there for shock value.
Exactly. And that's incredibly problematic.
Because what does it say about how we view male bodies?
Right. It reinforces this idea that they're expendable, that male suffering can be exploited for entertainment. And it desensitizes us to a form of violence that's incredibly real and traumatic for many men.
There was one video, I think it was called MGTOW, the Junk Files, #3, mutilation discrepancy.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It really hit on this, pointing out how many examples there are of this compared to, like, the almost non-existent depiction of female genital mutilation.
Right, right.
That really highlights a disturbing imbalance.
It raises some really uncomfortable questions about why one is considered acceptable entertainment while the other is taboo.
Exactly.
Why is male suffering so often depicted as a source of amusement, or cheap thrills?
It's a good question, and one that's not easy to answer.
Yeah.
So we've got this backdrop of, casual jokes and disturbing imagery.
Yeah.
But the sources also bring in some truly chilling, real-world examples of violence against male genitalia.
Yeah, it gets very real.
And what's particularly jarring is this trend of female-perpetrated violence in these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Wives, girlfriends, even mothers.
This is where the MGTOW perspective gets especially provocative and potentially controversial.
For sure.
They're arguing that this trend of female-on-male violence stems from this very societal acceptance of male devaluation that we've been talking about.
Right, right.
It's as if the normalization of violence against male anatomy in media and humor, for some people, it translates into real-world aggression.
And these sources, they're not just theorizing.
Yeah.
You included news reports, personal accounts.
Some of them are just awful.
Like that woman in the parking lot crushing a man's testicles over some dispute. The mother who used superglue to try to fix her son's injury.
It's a very dark side of this whole issue.
It's unsettling, and it forces us to confront a really difficult question. If society keeps telling us, even subtly, that male bodies are less valuable, does it make us more likely to condone or even perpetrate violence against them?
That's the question we need to be asking ourselves.
And it's not just about these extreme cases.
No.
The sources also point to the language we use every day to describe male anatomy.
It's fascinating how much of it is so ingrained that we don't even notice it.
You really go.
The sheer number of negative terms for male genitalia, the lack of equivalent language for female body parts, it all adds up to this sense of disrespect that's almost become normalized.
Yeah, and what's really striking is that even some men who are vocal advocates for men's rights seem to perpetuate this language. They'll use derogatory terms, crack jokes at the expense of male anatomy. It's almost like they're trying to downplay their own discomfort with the whole topic.
Like they're trying to fit in.
Exactly.
It highlights just how deeply these attitudes are woven into our culture. It's as if we've been conditioned to view male anatomy as something to be mocked, ridiculed, even feared.
Yeah, there's this video, MGTOW, the Junk Files #6.
Yeah.
Verbiage.
Right.
It does this really interesting breakdown of the language used for male versus female anatomy.
And the contrast is stark.
It's startling. It's like there's this unspoken hierarchy of value assigned to different body parts. And male anatomy, especially genitalia, is consistently placed at the bottom.
It's like we're saying it's the least important, the least worthy of respect.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about the power dynamics at play here. Who benefits from this devaluation of male bodies, and what are the consequences for men and for society as a whole?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely need to unpack further. But first, let's take a moment to consider the impact of all this on men's self-perception.
Okay.
I mean, if we're constantly being told, directly or indirectly, that our bodies are junk, how does that shape our sense of self-worth?
That's a crucial point, and something the MGTOW sources really emphasize. They argue that this constant barrage of negativity can lead to body image issues, shame, and a diminished sense of masculinity. It's not just about, feeling unattractive or whatever. These sources, they suggest that it can impact men's mental health, their relationships, even their overall sense of place in the world.
It's heavy stuff, no doubt. Something else that really struck me as I was going through all this is like this societal discomfort with male nudity.
Interesting.
It's like it's okay for a woman to be, scantily clad in a movie or a music video. But if a man shows too much skin, suddenly it's inappropriate, even repulsive.
That discrepancy is really interesting, yeah. It suggests that there's this underlying taboo around the male body, this idea that it's something to be hidden, controlled. And it all ties back into that devaluation we've been talking about. If society keeps telling us that male anatomy is something to be ashamed of, well, it becomes easier to dismiss or dehumanize men in general.
A few of these sources use the example of clothing restrictions.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's totally normal for a woman to wear, tight yoga pants or a form-fitting dress. But if a man wears something similar, he's suddenly the target of jokes or disgust.
It's a double standard for sure.
It's like there are different rules for how male and female bodies are allowed to exist in public spaces.
It's almost as if there's this unspoken rule that the male form must be contained, kept under wraps.
Like it's dangerous or something.
And that, I think, speaks volumes about how we view masculinity and male sexuality. It's something to be policed, shamed, and ultimately controlled.
One of the videos actually brought up the ancient Greeks.
Oh, interesting.
You know, how they celebrated the male form, their statues, their artwork. It often depicted nude men. And it wasn't seen as shameful or taboo.
It was seen as beautiful, powerful.
Exactly. It's like we've completely flipped the script somewhere along the way.
That historical context is really important. It shows that these attitudes toward the male body, they aren't inherent, they're not biological, they're socially constructed, which means they can change over time.
That's a good point.
And that's actually pretty helpful, I think. If we can learn these patterns, we can unlearn them too.
Food for thought for sure. But it does make me wonder, if we keep going down this path of male devaluation, where does it lead? What are the implications for individuals, for relationships, for society as a whole?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something these MGTOW sources really grapple with. They argue that devaluing an entire gender, telling them that their bodies are worthless, their pain is funny, their suffering is entertainment, it has a profound impact on everything, from mental health to social structures.
Like this ripple effect. You start with this negativity around male anatomy, and it spreads outward, affecting how men see themselves, how they interact with each other, how they relate to women.
That's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
It really is.
And while these sources offer some really valuable insights into the problem, they don't necessarily offer concrete solutions.
So where do we go from here? We've laid out this pretty bleak picture of how male bodies are perceived and treated. But what can we do about it?
Right. It feels like such a huge systemic issue.
It does.
It is a big issue. But I think it's important to remember that change starts with each of us.
Okay.
We can choose to be mindful of the language we use, challenge those harmful jokes and stereotypes, and support media that portrays male bodies in a positive and respectful light.
I like that. We can also have open and honest conversations with the people in our lives, friends, family members, colleagues.
Yes. The more we talk about these issues, the less taboo they become, and the more likely we are to see real change happen.
Exactly. It's about normalizing these conversations.
Exactly.
And, supporting organizations and initiatives that are working to promote gender equality and challenge harmful stereotypes.
There are people out there doing incredible work in this space. They deserve our support.
Absolutely. And it's crucial that we raise the next generation with a different understanding of gender, right?
Yes.
We need to teach boys and girls that all bodies are worthy of respect, that violence is never the answer, and that empathy and understanding are the foundations of healthy relationships.
It's a long-term project, for sure. But by taking those small steps, being mindful, being intentional in our actions, we can contribute to a more just and equitable world for everyone.
One thing that really resonated with me in these sources is that despite all the anger and frustration, there's also a sense of hope. These men, they believe that things can change, that we can build a better future for men and boys.
And that's a message worth amplifying. Change is always possible, but it requires awareness, action, and a collective commitment to creating a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And I think that's a good segue into the final part of this deep dive.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time exploring the problem, those ingrained attitudes that contribute to male devaluation. But the next segment, I want to focus on potential solutions. How do we move forward? How do we create positive change? How do we shift the narrative around male bodies and create a culture of respect and understanding? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and it can feel pretty heavy.
Yeah, no doubt.
But I think, the takeaway here is that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame, but about recognizing these patterns and starting to, shift the narrative.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful tools we have is language. The sources we've explored really show how language can be weaponized to devalue and demean, but it can also be used to uplift and empower.
For sure. There's one YouTube video that talks about the power of reclaiming language, encouraging men to, reject those negative terms for their bodies and start using language that reflects self-respect and worth.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. When we change the way we talk about ourselves, we change the way we see ourselves. And that can have a ripple effect on how others perceive us as well.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Kind of, yeah.
So instead of accepting that label of junk, we can choose to see male anatomy as something strong, beautiful, essential to life. we can reclaim those words and redefine what they mean.
That shift in perspective can be incredibly powerful. It allows men to embrace their bodies without shame. And it sends a message to society that male bodies are not objects to be ridiculed or abused, but sources of strength and pride.
And it's about challenging those harmful stereotypes we see in media and entertainment too, right?
Absolutely.
Instead of just laughing at the next groin shot in a movie, we can choose to speak up and say, hey, that's not funny. That's actually pretty messed up.
Right, and that can make a real difference. When we start questioning those seemingly harmless jokes and tropes, we start to chip away at the foundation of male devaluation. We start to create a culture where men's bodies are treated with respect, both on and off screen.
But it's not just about changing individual attitudes.
Right.
It's about systemic change too. We need to see more men in positions of power, more diverse voices in media, more support for organizations that are promoting gender equality.
Absolutely. Individual change is important, but it's not enough. We need to see those changes reflected in our institutions, our laws, our cultural narratives.
And one of the most important things we can do is raise the next generation with a different understanding of gender, right?
100%.
We need to teach boys and girls that all bodies are worthy of respect, that violence is never acceptable, and that empathy and understanding are essential for healthy relationships.
That's where real lasting change will come from. When we change the way children see the world, we change the world itself. We break those cycles of devaluation and create a future where everyone can thrive.
Powerful stuff. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the message you want to leave our listener with? What's that one thing they should hold on to?
I think the most important thing is this. Male devaluation. It's not just a men's issue, it's a human issue. And it's something we can all work together to change. It starts with awareness, but it requires action. Challenge those harmful patterns, speak up for what's right, and choose to create a world where all genders are valued and respected.
That's a powerful message. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. And to you, the listener, thank you for providing such thought-provoking material. This has been a real eye-opener. And I hope it's given you some things to think about as you move through the world. We'll get you on the next deep dive.